When I was 15, my father's death hollowed the world around me. It was as if his passing drew out the very breath of my existence, leaving me adrift in a silent sea of grief. He was buried in a sprawling cemetery that rested just across the Chicago border in Evanston, a place that seemed too serene, too picturesque for the sorrow it contained. The cemetery was a labyrinth of weathered stone and marble monuments, aged mausoleums, and headstones engraved with histories long forgotten. Towering oaks cast sprawling shadows over the graves, and in the spring, wildflowers timidly sprouted amidst the tombs, as though attempting to inject life into a realm of eternal rest. Despite the beauty of the cemetery, I couldn't bring myself to accompany my mother there in the months following my father's burial. My grief felt too raw, too sharp, and though I believed in the soul's endurance beyond death, I could not reconcile that belief with the sight of his grave, an unyielding reminder that his physical form lay beneath the earth, decaying. The first time my mother asked me to join her, I shook my head silently, unable to explain the tightening in my chest at the thought of it. She didn't press me but continued her visits alone, her devotion unwavering. I stayed behind, retreating into my memories. My father's laugh, rich and full of life, haunted the quiet corners of the house. His favorite chair sat vacant, as if waiting for his return. In the stillness of my room, I clutched at relics of him: a fraying baseball glove, an old photograph, the scent of his cologne lingering faintly in the folds of his sweater. Yet, as much as I clung to these fragments, they could not shield me from the silence that grew heavier with each passing day. Eventually, my mother stopped asking me to come with her. She never mentioned her visits anymore, though I knew she went regularly. Sometimes, I watched her through the window as she set off down the street, a bouquet of fresh flowers clasped in her hand. The sight filled me with guilt and longing, but I couldn't will my feet to follow her. Time passed, and though the rawness of my grief began to dull, the weight of his loss lingered like a stone lodged in my chest. One morning in early spring, I woke to find the world awash in sunlight. The air was crisp and smelled faintly of earth and budding greenery. It was the kind of day my father would have loved, perfect for working in the yard or taking a long walk along the lakefront. His absence struck me more sharply in moments like these, when his love of simple pleasures became an aching void. That morning, something shifted within me. Perhaps it was the warmth of the sunlight or the hope carried in the breeze, but I found myself seeking my mother in the kitchen. "Let's go to the cemetery today," I said, surprising myself as much as her. My voice trembled slightly, but I felt determined. "It's Dad's birthday soon. We should lay some flowers." The words felt strange as they left my mouth, like they belonged to someone braver, someone more prepared to confront what I had avoided for so long. My heart pounded, the heaviness of the suggestion weighing on me immediately, but there was also a strange lightness in speaking it aloud, like letting in a small breath of air after holding it for far too long. Her face lit up with a mix of surprise and relief. For a moment, she just stared at me, her eyes glistening as if she were processing what I had said. "Are you sure?" she asked gently, her voice careful, as though afraid a single wrong word might shatter my resolve. I nodded, swallowing hard. "I'm sure." The relief in her expression deepened, softening the lines of grief that had etched themselves into her face over the months since my father's passing. Her shoulders relaxed, and I could almost see her holding back tears. "Okay," she said softly. "Let's go in the morning." That night, I lay awake for hours, staring at the ceiling. The thought of going back to the cemetery churned in my mind, equal parts dread and anticipation. The last time I had been there, on the day of the funeral. The memory was still vivid, like a wound that refused to heal. I remembered the cold, damp air clinging to my skin, the weight of the silence that had settled over everyone like a suffocating blanket. The sound of dirt falling onto the coffin had echoed in my mind for weeks afterward, an unrelenting reminder of the finality of it all. But tomorrow would be different. It had to be. This wouldn't be about saying goodbye again. This would be about remembrance, about love. At least, that's what I told myself as I fought to quiet the unease building in my chest. I wasn't sure if I was ready, but the thought of bringing a small sense of joy to my mother, to see her light up even briefly, gave me the strength to push through the lingering fear. We set out later that morning, a small bouquet of white lilies and yellow roses in hand. My mother chose the flowers carefully, explaining that lilies symbolized renewal and hope, while the roses spoke of love and remembrance. The mile-long walk to the cemetery felt longer than I expected, and the weight of my decision settled heavily in my chest with each step. When we reached the cemetery gates, I paused for a moment, taking in the vast expanse of stone and shadow before me. The air seemed colder here, and the silence was almost tangible, broken only by the occasional rustle of leaves in the wind. As we entered, my eyes wandered over the graves, reading the names and dates etched into the stones. Some were simple, others ornate, adorned with statues of angels or intricate carvings of vines and flowers. Many of the headstones bore inscriptions, poetic verses or heartfelt epitaphs that spoke of love, loss, and the hope of reunion in the hereafter. My mother led the way, following the winding path that would take us to my father's grave. I trailed behind her, my gaze drawn to the older sections of the cemetery where the headstones dated back to the Civil War. These stones were worn and weathered, the names and dates barely legible in some cases. I couldn't help but wonder about the lives they represented, the stories they carried. Who were these people? What had they loved, feared, or dreamed? The thought was both fascinating and unsettling, a reminder of the impermanence of life. The further we walked, the heavier the air seemed to grow. The shadows deepened, even under the midday sun, and a strange stillness settled over the cemetery. It was then that I noticed something glinting in the grass near the edge of the path. My curiosity got the better of me, and I stepped away from the road to investigate. The object was small and metallic, its surface catching the sunlight in a way that made it impossible to ignore. I bent down and picked it up, turning it over in my hand. It was ornate, with intricate engravings that seemed both beautiful and eerie. At first, I thought it might be a piece of jewelry, but as I examined it more closely, I realized it was something else entirely. I had no idea what it was, but the weight of it in my palm felt significant, almost oppressive. A strange unease prickled at the back of my neck, but I dismissed it, chalking it up to the somber surroundings. When my mother turned back to see what was keeping me, her expression changed instantly. The color drained from her face, and her eyes widened in a mix of fear and anger. She hurried back to me, her movements brisk and urgent. "What are you doing with that?" she demanded, her voice sharper than I had ever heard it. The rest of her words hung unsaid in the air, but they echoed through my mind like a warning. We stood frozen on the winding cemetery road, the light breeze teasing at the edges of the silence that had fallen between us. My mother's expression was one I had never seen before, her eyes wide with dread, her face pale and taut as though she were physically restraining a scream. I looked down at the object in my hand, its weight seeming to grow heavier with every passing second. The engraved metal glinted faintly in the filtered sunlight, but now it felt cold against my palm, colder than it should have been. "I found it, just over there," I said hesitantly, pointing to the patch of grass near the curve in the road where it had caught my eye. My voice was small, as if I already understood on some instinctual level that this was no ordinary trinket. "It needs to go back," my mother said sharply, cutting me off before I could ask any more questions. Her hand trembled as she gestured for me to return it. "Exactly where you found it. Right now." Her urgency frightened me. My mother was not a woman prone to dramatics. She was practical, grounded, someone who had faced my father's death with an unshakable resolve, even when grief must have weighed heavily on her. For her to react this way meant something was deeply wrong. I turned on shaky legs, retracing my steps toward the spot I had indicated. My hand hovered uncertainly above the ground as I prepared to set the object back down. "I'm sorry," I mumbled under my breath, though I wasn't entirely sure why. The words spilled out of me instinctively, as if the act of taking the object had already imprinted a sense of guilt on my soul. I placed it carefully in the grass, exactly as I'd found it, then straightened and turned to look at my mother. She nodded but didn't move closer. Instead, she watched the spot intently, her expression still clouded with unease. "What is it?" I asked finally, my voice trembling. "What's wrong?" She hesitated for a moment, glancing around as if she were worried someone or something might overhear. Then, in a low, tense voice, she said, "It's a coffin handle. It belongs to someone. Someone buried here." Her words sent a chill down my spine. I stared at the spot where I had placed the handle, a sinking feeling settling in my stomach. A coffin handle. The realization hit me with grim finality. This wasn't some lost piece of jewelry or a harmless trinket, it was a part of something sacred, something meant to stay with the dead. I suddenly felt as though the air around me had grown heavier, colder, pressing down on me like an unseen weight. "You can't take things from a cemetery," my mother continued, her voice trembling slightly now. "It's not just disrespectful, it's dangerous. You're disturbing someone's rest. Their spirit could follow you." I wanted to dismiss her words, to laugh them off as superstition, but the look in her eyes stopped me. She believed what she was saying with an intensity that made my chest tighten. And as much as I wanted to, I couldn't shake the eerie feeling that had settled over me since I'd picked up the handle. There had been something unnatural about its coldness, the way it seemed to pulse faintly against my skin. I shivered, suddenly desperate to leave the cemetery and put as much distance as possible between myself and whatever I had just disturbed. As I placed the coffin handle back onto the grass, muttering an awkward, almost instinctive apology under my breath, an odd sensation washed over me. The air around the spot seemed heavier, as though it were charged with some invisible force. A subtle vibration traveled up my fingertips when I let the handle go, like a faint pulse emanating from the ground beneath it. It wasn't something I could easily explain, but I felt it deep in my chest, a sense of being observed, or worse, acknowledged. My mother stood a few paces away, arms crossed tightly over her chest. Her posture was rigid, her expression unreadable, but her eyes darted nervously between me and the handle as though she feared something might burst forth from the earth. After a moment of silence, she finally relaxed her shoulders a little and nodded toward me. "Good," she said softly, though there was little relief in her tone. "Now let's go. Don't look back." The way she emphasized those last words sent a fresh chill through me. I wanted to ask her more, to demand why she seemed so certain, why she acted as though the mere touch of that object could summon something terrible. But the look on her face stopped me. There was a finality to her tone, a wall of unspoken experiences she wasn't ready to share. I didn't press her, but the weight of my own curiosity, and the unease the handle had left me with, was impossible to ignore. We walked back along the winding cemetery road in near silence, my eyes glued to the ground ahead of me. I couldn't bring myself to look back at the place where I had found the handle, no matter how strong the urge became. The hairs on the back of my neck stood on end, and I felt an irrational sense that something or someone was standing there, watching us leave. The further we got from the spot, the more the sensation faded, but it never disappeared entirely. When we finally reached the gates of the cemetery, my mother stopped abruptly and turned to face me. Her voice was firm but quiet, the kind of voice she used when she wanted to make absolutely certain I understood the seriousness of what she was saying. "Never take anything from a cemetery," she said. "Not even a flower, not a pebble, nothing. Do you understand me? No matter what you find, leave it where it belongs." I nodded, swallowing hard. The tightness in her jaw, the sharpness in her eyes, it was clear this wasn't just some vague superstition to her. This was a rule she had lived by, one she expected me to follow as well. I wanted to ask her why, to dig deeper into the source of her fear, but again, her expression warned me not to push. "Come on," my mother said, her voice softer now but still firm. "Let's go. We've done what we came here to do." She glanced briefly at the flowers we had brought for my father, her brow furrowing. "We'll visit your dad's grave another day." She turned and began walking briskly back the way we had come, her movements tense and hurried. I hesitated for a moment, glancing back at the curve in the road where the handle lay gleaming faintly in the grass. The shadows around it seemed darker now, deeper, as if the sunlight refused to touch it. A part of me wanted to run after my mother without looking back, but another part, a stubborn, questioning part, kept me rooted in place. What would have happened if I'd taken it home? The thought was a dark whisper in the back of my mind, one that sent another shiver racing down my spine. But as I stood there, a sudden gust of wind swept through the cemetery, rustling the leaves in the trees and carrying with it a faint, almost imperceptible sound. It was low and mournful, like the distant wail of a voice long forgotten. My heart leapt into my throat, and I bolted after my mother, my footsteps pounding against the gravel path. By the time we reached the cemetery gates, I was out of breath, my chest heaving with a mixture of exertion and fear. My mother didn't say a word as we walked home, her lips pressed into a thin, grim line. The flowers in her hand remained untouched, their bright colors a stark contrast to the growing dread that hung between us. I wanted to ask her more about the handle, about why she had been so adamant that I return it, but I couldn't find the words. The memory of her fear, so raw, so palpable, kept my questions lodged in my throat. That night, I couldn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw the cemetery in my mind, the winding road, the ancient headstones, the patch of grass where I had found the handle. The shadows seemed to creep closer with each passing moment, and the faint wail I'd heard lingered in my ears, growing louder and more insistent in the quiet of my room. I pulled the covers tightly around me, my heart racing with a fear I couldn't fully explain. As the hours dragged on, I began to feel a strange sensation, as if I were being watched. The air in my room felt heavier, colder, and a faint chill prickled at the back of my neck. I tried to tell myself it was just my imagination, the lingering effects of my mother's warning and the eerie atmosphere of the cemetery. But the feeling didn't go away. It grew stronger, more oppressive, until I found myself lying completely still, too afraid to move. And then, in the darkness, I heard it, a soft, almost imperceptible sound. It was faint at first, barely more than a whisper, but it grew steadily louder, echoing in the stillness of the room. It was the same sound I had heard in the cemetery, that low, mournful wail. But now, it was closer. Much closer. I squeezed my eyes shut, my breath coming in shallow gasps as I clutched the covers tightly around me. The sound seemed to fill the room, wrapping around me like a suffocating shroud. And then, just as suddenly as it had begun, it stopped. The silence that followed was even more terrifying. It was deep and absolute, pressing down on me like the weight of the grave itself. I lay there for what felt like hours, too terrified to open my eyes, until exhaustion finally pulled me into a restless, haunted sleep. When I woke the next morning, the feeling of dread still lingered, like a shadow that refused to be banished by the light of day. And though I tried to push the memory of the previous night to the back of my mind, I couldn't escape the nagging sense that something had followed me home from the cemetery. Something that wasn't ready to let me go. Next night, as I lay in bed, I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't quite right. The room was dark, quiet, perfectly still, yet the edges of the silence felt sharper than usual, as though the quietness itself carried weight. My mind wandered back to the cemetery, to the grave markers and statues casting long shadows in the sunlight, to the cold, polished surface of the coffin handle. What had I disturbed by touching it? My mother's warning about spirits following me rang in my ears, and I felt foolish for even letting the idea cross my mind. It was just a piece of metal, I told myself. Nothing more. But as the hours crept by and sleep refused to come, a strange unease began to creep over me. I shifted restlessly beneath the covers, staring up at the ceiling. The darkness of the room seemed to grow deeper, more oppressive, and for a fleeting moment, I thought I saw movement in the corner of my eye, a flicker of shadow that didn't belong. My heart thudded painfully in my chest as I turned my head sharply, only to find the room exactly as it should be. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. The next morning, I woke groggy and irritable, the remnants of a restless night clinging to me like cobwebs. My mother noticed immediately. She studied me closely over breakfast, her sharp eyes searching my face as though she already knew what I was going to say. I hesitated, unsure of whether to tell her about the strange sensations I'd experienced during the night, the oppressive darkness, the flicker of shadow. Part of me didn't want to admit that I'd let her warnings get to me. "Did you sleep well?" she asked finally, her voice neutral but probing. I shook my head, avoiding her gaze. "Just weird dreams," I said. It wasn't exactly a lie, but it wasn't the full truth either. She nodded slowly, her lips pressing into a thin line. "It's probably nothing," she said, though her tone suggested otherwise. "But keep your mind clear. Don't dwell on it. Sometimes that's all it takes." Her cryptic advice left me more confused than reassured, but I didn't push for clarification. Instead, I tried to go about my day as normally as possible, burying myself in homework and chores to distract from the lingering sense of unease. But as the hours passed, the feeling only grew stronger. The shadows in the corners of the room seemed deeper than they should have been, and I could swear I heard faint, almost imperceptible noises, soft creaks, distant whispers, just at the edge of my hearing. Each time I turned to look, there was nothing there. That evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon and the house settled into its nightly stillness, the atmosphere grew heavier. I sat in the living room, pretending to read a book, but my attention was elsewhere. The air seemed colder, and every so often, I felt the distinct sensation of being watched. It wasn't just paranoia, I was certain of it. There was a presence, an awareness, lingering just out of sight. My pulse quickened as I remembered my mother's words. Could it be? Had something followed me home? I clenched my fists tightly, my thoughts racing. It was ridiculous, wasn't it? Spirits, curses, vengeful ghosts, these were things out of stories, not real life. And yet, the memory of the coffin handle, the sharpness of my mother's fear, and the weight of the cemetery's silence refused to let go. It felt as though I had crossed an invisible line, one that I couldn't uncross. As night fell, the house grew quieter, and my anxiety peaked. I found myself checking the locks on the doors and windows, as though whatever I felt could be kept out by something so mundane. The sense of being watched never left me, and when I finally climbed into bed, I felt no safer than I had during the previous night. I lay there in the dark, my heart pounding in my chest, my ears straining to catch any sound out of the ordinary. And then, just as I began to drift off, I heard it, a soft, almost imperceptible sound, like the faint scraping of metal against wood. My eyes flew open, my breath catching in my throat. The sound came again, louder this time, and I realized with growing horror that it was coming from outside my bedroom door. My hands gripped the covers tightly, my body frozen in place. The scraping noise grew closer, dragging slowly down the length of the hallway. It stopped just outside my door, and for a moment, there was only silence. I held my breath, every muscle in my body tense with dread. Then, faintly, I heard a whisper. It was low, guttural, and indecipherable, but it carried a weight that made my skin crawl. The door creaked softly, as though something was pressing against it, testing the barrier. I wanted to scream, to bolt out of bed and run, but I couldn't move. All I could do was lie there, paralyzed with fear, as the whispering grew louder and the shadows in the room seemed to close in around me. Even now, decades later, I shudder to think of what might have happened had I taken the coffin handle home. The memory of that night, the whispers in the hallway, and the oppressive presence in my bedroom have never left me. I still can't explain what I experienced, nor do I try to rationalize it. Some things are simply beyond understanding. That night, as the scraping and whispers grew louder, I was certain that I would not survive until morning. My body was paralyzed with fear, my breaths shallow and quick as I clung to the blanket like it was a shield against the impossible. The whispering wasn't just sound, it was a weight that pressed down on me, filled with malice and longing, as though whatever was on the other side of the door was demanding something from me, something I could not give. And then it stopped. The silence that followed was suffocating. I strained to hear anything, footsteps retreating, the creak of the floorboards, but there was nothing. The oppressive weight in the air didn't lift, but it shifted, moving away from me like a shadow fading into deeper darkness. For the rest of the night, I didn't sleep. I didn't dare move. I lay in the same position, my heart hammering in my chest, waiting for whatever it was to return. When the first light of dawn broke through my curtains, I finally dared to breathe. The sunlight brought a small measure of relief, though the house still felt heavy with something unseen. I mustered the courage to leave my bed and open the door, half expecting to find scratches gouged into the wood or some other sign of what had been there. But the door was unmarked, the hallway empty and still. Despite the lack of evidence, I knew what I had felt, what I had heard. It was real. And it wasn't over. Over the following days, the atmosphere in the house grew more oppressive. Small things began to happen: lights flickering, objects moving slightly out of place, faint noises that had no clear source. My mother seemed to notice it too, though she said nothing. She moved through the house with a quiet tension, as if she could feel the same thing I did. Her eyes lingered on shadows too long, and more than once, I caught her whispering under her breath prayers, perhaps, or some sort of plea for protection. I couldn't bear the growing tension. One afternoon, I finally broke down and told her about the noises in the hallway, the whispers outside my door. I expected her to dismiss it, to tell me it was just my imagination or the aftereffects of my brief encounter with the coffin handle. Instead, she grew pale, her lips pressing into a tight line. "You've angered something," she said finally, her voice barely above a whisper. "And it won't let go until it's satisfied." Her words terrified me. The way she said them, with such grim certainty, left no room for doubt. She refused to explain further, only saying that we needed to return to the cemetery. She wouldn't say why, but I knew. Deep down, I knew. We returned to the cemetery that evening. My mother carried a bundle of fresh flowers and a small candle, which she lit as we approached the spot where I had found the handle. The cemetery felt different this time, darker, colder, even though the sun was just beginning to set. The shadows seemed to stretch longer, and the air was unnaturally still. My mother knelt on the grass, placing the flowers carefully near the spot where I had returned the handle. Then she closed her eyes and began to pray. I stood behind her, feeling more helpless than I ever had in my life. I didn't know what I was supposed to do, but the growing weight in the air told me that whatever I had disturbed was still there, watching, waiting. My mother's prayers grew louder, more fervent, as though she was speaking directly to something that I couldn't see. "Please," she said finally, her voice breaking. "We're sorry. She didn't mean to disturb your rest. Please, leave her be." The words hung in the air, and for a moment, everything was silent. Then, the wind picked up. It was sudden and strong, rustling through the trees and scattering the petals of the flowers my mother had laid down. The candle's flame flickered and died, plunging us into twilight. My mother grabbed my hand, her grip like iron, and pulled me to my feet. "Let's go," she said, her voice trembling. "We've done all we can." As we walked back through the cemetery, I felt the same sensation of being watched, but this time, it was different. It wasn't malicious. It was resigned. Whatever presence had been following me, tormenting me, seemed to linger at the edge of the cemetery, as though it could not or would not leave. When we crossed the gates, the air lifted slightly, and I felt a glimmer of relief for the first time in days. That night, I slept without incident. The whispers were gone, the oppressive weight no longer lingering in the corners of the house. It was as if whatever had been there had finally let go. But the experience left its mark on me. I never returned to that cemetery, not for my father's grave, not for anything. The thought of stepping foot there again filled me with a visceral dread I couldn't shake. My mother continued to visit, though she never asked me to join her again. Over time, life moved on. The memories of that incident faded, though they never disappeared entirely. Even now, decades later, I think about that coffin handle, about the strange pull it had and the terror that followed. I wonder what would have happened if I had been more careless, if I had taken it home as a keepsake. Would the spirit have followed me forever? Would it have escalated, growing angrier, more dangerous, until it consumed me? I'll never know, and I don't want to. To this day, I avoid cemeteries. Even when loved ones pass, I find ways to pay my respects without stepping onto those hallowed grounds. The dead deserve their peace, and I have no desire to disturb them again. My mother's warning echoes in my mind whenever I think about that day: never take anything from a cemetery. Not a flower, not a pebble, nothing. So I ask you, my friend, have you ever heard of this belief? Do you think it's possible that a spirit might follow you if you take something that belongs to them? I don't have the answer, but I know this: sometimes it's better not to find out. Some boundaries aren't meant to be crossed, and some questions are better left unanswered.